It's really nice to be talking to you all this morning, or I'm in New York, so it's my afternoon, just about, to talk to you about my first book, Nazi Billionaires, which was published last Tuesday. It's also nice to be talking to a group in Irvine. I once wrote a profile for Bloomberg News about Donald Bren, and I got to visit Irvine then. So I'll tell a little bit about myself. I'm currently in New York City, but I am a Middle East correspondent for the Dutch Financial Daily. I am of origin, I am Dutch, but I worked for Bloomberg News as a reporter in New York. That's also how I got to cover this topic. And I'm here in New York now because the book got published in the US last week. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got on the topic of Nazi billionaires and how I got on the topic of covering, German business dynasties and their Nazi histories, and their reckoning, or their flawed reckoning with that past. So in November 2011, I started working for Bloomberg News in New York as a reporter on a new team, an investigative team that covered hidden wealth and family-owned companies. As some of you may know, Bloomberg News is mainly known for covering companies listed on the stock exchange. So for them, one of their black spots was covering companies that are family-owned, that are privately held, that are not listed on a stock exchange. And I was hired as one of the reporters covering North America, but I was soon asked, because I'm Dutch, I was asked to cover the German-speaking countries. Now, I did this with a little bit of hesitance because of my own family history. I call it in a book. I was born in the late 1980s, and I'm probably of the last generation that grew up with this, I call it in a book, playful antagonism vis-a-vis the Germans. Of course, the brutal occupation that befell the Netherlands from May 1940 to May 1945 is very much ingrained in our national consciousness. This playful antagonism mainly exerted itself near or on the soccer field, which is the main sport in the Netherlands and in most of Western Europe. But also because of my own family history, my maternal grandfather was a very avid sailor, and he tried to sail to England during the war. And the second time, his sailboat was blown back ashore at the Dutch coast, and he was apprehended by German soldiers. And him and his best friend were sentenced as political prisoners to 2 years forced labor in Germany, in the Ruhr area. My grandfather was 6'7", and he survived, and he came out weighing 90 pounds after his 2 years of slave labor in a German steel factory. Now, from my father's side, who were Jewish, my grandfather hid in Amsterdam for 3.5 years for the duration of the war, or for most of the part of the war, after his textile factories at the Dutch-German border were seized and confiscated. And my grandmother and 3-year-old aunt, my grandmother was a Swiss citizen, but she married my grandfather, who was Dutch. They fled to, or they tried to flee to Switzerland with a companion, and they were arrested by a Gestapo officer at the French-Swiss border, and they you know, by some miracle, my grandmother and the Gestapo officer took pity on my grandmother and 3-year-old aunt, and they were let go, or the Gestapo officer sent something like "stay somewhere else tonight," with the implication you have to flee tonight or else you'll be deported. But and they made it safely over the border to Switzerland. But her companion was deported to Sobibor and murdered there. So, as I also explained in the book, you know, I had some hesitancy when my bosses asked me to cover the German-speaking countries for Bloomberg. But of course, you know, I was a 25-year-old reporter. I didn't dare say no to my bosses. You just say yes and you do your job. And I'm actually eternally grateful that they gave me that chance, because, you know, what I found was this wealth of stories mixing, you know, the financial and the historical, and particularly the brazen whitewashing by companies like BMW and Porsche, where they're celebrating their business patriarchs, you know, for their patriarchs, for their business successes, but leave out, you know, their war crimes that they committed, or the, you know, or their Nazi affiliations that they had. Which, for example, today you have the BMW Foundation Herbert Quandt, which is a global foundation, which has the motto, "Inspire responsible leadership," because Herbert Quandt saved BMW in 1959 from bankruptcy, but fails to admit that he designed, built, and dismantled the sub-concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Poland, that he had the responsibility over battery factories in Berlin with thousands of forced and slave laborers, including 500 female slave laborers from concentration camps, that he acquired companies seized from Jews in France, and that he used prisoners of war and forced laborers on his own private estate. A similar story with Ferry Porsche, who designed the first Porsche. You have the Ferry Porsche Foundation today, which is in existence because Ferry Porsche designed the first sports car, but fails to admit that Ferry Porsche applied to the SS in 1938, was admitted as an SS officer in 1941, surrounded himself as Porsche CEO with former high-ranking SS officers in the 1950s and 60s, and in his biography, in his first autobiography, We at Porsche, in the late 1970s, spew virulent anti-Semitic vitriol about Porsche's co-founder, Adolf Rosenberger, who ended up, who was bought out of Porsche far below the market value of his shares, and in 1935, and ended up fleeing to the United States and settling in Los Angeles. So that gave me the impetus to write the book. Bringing these stories to light, bringing historical transparency to the subject, as these global companies and these very powerful and wealthy families are whitewashing their Nazi past. So I chose 5 families that I'm writing about. One is the Quandt dynasty, which is Germany's wealthiest family today. 2 of the Quandt heirs today control BMW. I write about the Flick dynasty. Friedrich Flick, a very notorious, perhaps Germany's most notorious industrialist of the 20th century, controlled Nazi Germany's largest privately held steel, coal, and weapons conglomerate, was convicted at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. His sentence was commuted on good behavior by the United States in 1950. And within a decade, he was back on top as Germany's wealthiest man, as a controlling shareholder of Daimler-Benz. Thirdly, I write about the von Fink family, which are the co-founders of Allianz and Munich Re, the largest insurers and reinsurers in the world. And they, father and son, August von Fink, were ideological Nazis, anti-Semites, and also one of Germany's wealthiest families. And they fundraised. Hitler gave them the assignment to fundraise money to build the Museum of German Art in Munich. And he fundraised about 20 million Reichsmark from his fellow tycoons and fellow industrialists and financiers. And as a thank you, he was rewarded by the Nazi regime to expropriate the Rothschild Bank in Vienna, the Austrian branch of the Rothschild family, and the Dreyfus family in Berlin, the Dreyfus Bank in Berlin. Von Fink also got off scot-free after the war and is still today one of Germany's wealthiest investing families. Fourthly, I write about the Porsche-Piech family, who the patriarch Ferdinand Porsche, of course, famously designed the Volkswagen and convinced Hitler to put it into production. And his son Ferry Porsche, as I explained earlier, designed the first Porsche sports car. And today, the Porsche-Piech clan controls the Volkswagen Group, which owns such global brands as Porsche, Volkswagen, Audi, Bentley, Lamborghini, and many others. Fifthly, I write about the Oetker family, which is mainly a European conglomerate. They control a conglomerate which controls everything from Germany's largest beer brewer to a chain of luxury hotels in Europe and the United States, as well as a baking goods empire. So those are the 5 families I'm writing about. And, I think I'll leave the rest for you all to read. So I wanted to go into any questions that you may have stemming from the book or from what I've just told you.
Okay, well, Martin asks, what about U.S. companies that participated in the war on behalf of Germany, companies such as Ford and IBM?
Yeah.
And he says, I believe that Watson actually met Hitler in Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are excellent academic monographies on the brutal history of the participation of IBM in the Holocaust, as well as General Motors. And of course, another famous example is that of Henry Ford, who was a virulent anti-Semite and a Hitler supporter. Of course, General Motors was mainly involved because they acquired Opel, a German car brand, in 1928. So one of their main subsidiaries was operated and manufactured cars mainly for the European market.
Okay. I guess the question is, why did so many of these families get off without being critically disciplined or whatever, or whatever?
So, soon after World War II ends, the Cold War begins, and America, for initially the Truman government makes a policy decision to, instead of punishing Germany and its industrialists and its businessmen, but not only, but just generally Germany and generally its citizens, they go from a policy of punishment to a policy of rebuilding West Germany to serve as a bulwark against the encroachment of the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union had in East Germany a satellite state. West Germany and a reunified Germany is today Europe's and one of the world's largest economies. So the United States needed wanted a viable Germany, both economically and politically, as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. So what happens is, you have the main Nuremberg trials. 12 succession trials happen in which Friedrich Flick, who I mentioned earlier, and his associates are indicted and convicted. Alfred Krupp of the namesake Steel dynasty and his associates are indicted and convicted. And you have the IG Farben, Germany's largest chemical, or the world's largest chemical company at that point in time, its board indicted and convicted. But of course, these only represented a very tiny fraction of those businessmen, industrialists, and financiers who were responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Third Reich and more specifically during World War II. But what happens instead is that the United States and the United Kingdom start handing over suspected Nazi perpetrators and sympathizers back to Germany in what became known as denazification proceedings. You hear the word denazification a lot today because it is what the word Vladimir Putin is using to justify what he's doing in Ukraine, which is in my opinion, obscene and perverse, because how you can speak of that is just, beyond anything. But the notion of denazification was actually a very flawed legal process that saw millions of Germans get off scot-free for their Nazi crimes and sympathies, because there were these layman trials that were held all across Western and Eastern Germany that became show trials basically, and not show trials of punishment, but show trials of that everyone got off scot-free. So that is what happens. And in 1950, with the outbreak of the Korean War, initially Truman and Eisenhower invoked the War Defense Act, which blocks most of production in factories for the manufacturing of arms in the United States. And West Germany is able to fill that gap as the main industrialized country in the Western world. And you have this massive economic boom called the economic miracle in West Germany. And within a decade, or within 5-6 years, those who were considered, enemies of the state or Nazi perpetrators only 5 to 10 years ago are now, celebrated again as Germany's most successful industrialists and businessmen and in global business.
Martin, you have your hand up. You unmute yourself, please, and ask your question. Martin? Martin, did you hear me? Okay.
I've unmuted myself. Sorry about that. So the first thing I wanted to do was thank you for coming to speak to us. For me, it was very informative. I do have a question on one comment that you made during your brief presentation, and that is you said that war crimes that the companies, meaning the German companies, committed. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, they're German companies. They, of course, had to support the war as we had to support our interests. What do you mean by war crimes that the companies committed?
Pardon, I mean those owners of the companies that were held. I mean, the entities itself could, of course, not be held responsible. I'm referring to the owners, the executive, that were held responsible for the atrocities, whether there was the mass use of forced and slave labor, whether there was the expropriation and seizing of Jewish-owned companies or of companies owned by non-Jews in Nazi-occupied territories, or the mass production of armaments, that those ended up being indicted at the succeeding Nuremberg trials, either on war crimes or crimes against humanity. The entities itself, of course, were not indicted. I'm talking about the owners, the executives that were put on trial.
Okay.
With the concepts that were developed during the main Nuremberg trial.
All right. Have these companies ever publicly renounced their activities during the war with their war crimes?
I mean, there was, in the 1990s, there was a settlement after many class act lawsuits were filed in the United States against some of Germany's largest companies. Now, under the agreement that was made between the United States government and the German government, none of the German companies involved in the use of forced slave labor had to admit any sense of wrongdoing or culpability. That was one of the agreements of there was one of the stipulants of the agreement that were made between the US government and the German government in the deal that was made in 1999, from which compensation was paid to surviving forced laborers or slave laborers or their heirs.
I'd like to ask you, to me, it's not surprising that these people once again regained wealth and power.
Mm-hmm.
Was it surprising to you? And let me ask you, Germany was divided for many years.
Yeah.
And like for the scientists, Russians and the Americans in the West were falling all over themselves to get as many of those people to come to our side. Now, were there any industrialists in East Germany that actually became quite prominent in that system after the war?
Oh, that's a very good question. As to your first question, no, I'm not surprised by the fact that they regained their money and power. That is the nature of capitalism, because of course most of their assets after 1945 they still retain. So the fact that they were not punished is one thing. The fact that they kept their assets, that were not expropriated by the Soviet Union, right, in the occupied part of Germany, or at least the Soviet occupied part of Germany. The Americans and the Brits and the French, to an extent, considered expropriation, and some companies were broken up, like IG Farben, for instance, which now you have Bayer and BASF, still two of the world's largest companies that flowed from the breakup of IG Farben. But eventually they decided against the decartelization and deconcentration of German industry for the reasons I explained, that the United States particularly wanted a strong and viable West Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Now, to your second question, I have not come across, all the German industrialists fled to West Germany, or at least those that were not apprehended by the Soviet Union and were never to be seen again, although those are very few. Most got out in time before the Soviet Union occupied Berlin, or occupied most of Berlin, and of course the surrounding German states, and kept it under their occupation for 45 years. But that's a very interesting question. No, I have not come across any of those examples of any successful German industrialists who thrived in the East German communist system. It would also be a little bit antithetical to the communist system itself. where of course apparatchiks and the Stasi and you know and communist officials or those related to Germany's Socialist Party thrived.
Whatever happened to Krupp, which survived the war?
Yeah.
And at the same time, did your investigations turn up any reference to cartels that met in Switzerland during the war, consisting of American bankers and industrialists that were concerned about their assets throughout Europe and were doing their best to conserve them?
So Alfred Krupp, together with his father Gustav, were indicted at the Nuremberg trials. Gustav was too senile to stand trial, so he wasn't he was deemed not compos mentis anymore. He died shortly afterwards. But Alfred and his managers were indicted and sentenced also for war crimes and crimes against humanity that occurred in the Krupp Steel Empire during World War II and during the Third Reich. And actually, Krupp was one of the few industrialists who was sentenced to having part of his steel empire to be expropriated. Now, in 1950, so he's sentenced to 12 years in prison in 1948, early 1948. His sentence is commuted 2 years later. So he was supposed to be in jail until 1960, and part of his steel empire was never to be returned. With the appointment of John J. McCloy as the High Commissioner of Occupied Germany, another political decision is made, which is related to the Korean War, and the Cold War, is that all these sentences, I mentioned Friedrich Flick earlier, but Alfred Krupp too, but not only of those two industrialists, but also of many high-ranking SS officers whose death sentences were commuted or changed to life sentences, and those life sentences were then commuted to freedom or to release. They are released en masse in 1950. John J. McCloy, on the instruction of Harry Truman and later of Ike Eisenhower, makes a political decision to appease the West German government under Konrad Adenauer and its citizens, which again they need as an ally in the Cold War, in the Korean War, and as well in the burgeoning NATO and the Western European integration. So not only is Alfred Krupp released in 1950 after having spent 2 years under his sentence and 5 years in prison in total, but his industrial empire as well is reinstated, and what has been expropriated is returned to him by the United States government. Now, to your second question, I have not come across any evidence of kind of cartel meetings in Bern or Zurich between American bankers and industrialists who try to get their assets out of either Switzerland or Germany. What I have heard about and read about is about, of course, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles' John Foster Dulles' brother and the co-founder of the CIA, if I believe, or of the OSS, efforts to recruit German industrialists and not only, but also SS officers to spy on behalf of the United States government. And Dulles was based in Bern for the most part. And there's many that points to his efforts in that direction.
I'm curious. The Nazi Party started off in the 20s as a minority group.
Yeah.
But did they easily get support from these industrialists to?
No, they did not. So this changed. So between 1924 and 1925, when the Nazi Party, well, not so much starts its rise, but starts its existence or starts its outward existence. And I would say mid 1930, there was very little, barely any support by businessmen, by Germany's establishment for Adolf Hitler. They regarded the Nazi Party and its supporters as boorish, garish, kind of, uniformed clowns from the impoverished German hinterlands, and not to be taken seriously. Now, this changes in the wake of the start of the Great Depression, and of course, October 1929, Black Tuesday, the wipeout of Wall Street. Germany is hit by, the Great Depression commences. Germany faces mass unemployment, and on that rise, now the Nazi Party has its first, or on those events, the Nazi Party has its first electoral success in September 1930. They blame it on the Jews, on the communists, on the social democrats, and in September 1930 they have their massive first electoral success. And at that point, Hitler, who also does not have barely has any connections in the business world, asks his main economic advisor, we're gathering steam, we're becoming influential, we contacts contacts to industrialists and financiers. And his economic advisor then starts to invite many of the main characters in my book to a hotel in Berlin to introduce himself and try to get them to come to the Nazi side. And initially, then they're still reluctant. They are conservative, but they're establishment conservatives. They regard Hitler, who is not even technically German, as a kind of as a freak, as a lunatic, but somebody who's gaining power incrementally. It is not only until he seizes power in January 1933 that they come around to his cause, because Germany has gone through, since the end of World War I, through 15 years of instability, economic volatility, hyperinflation, the Great Depression, and they want stability for their companies and their own fortunes and their employees. And that is what Hitler is seemingly promises them, is economic stability and viability under his leadership.
Thank you. Martin, you have your hand up again. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, please, and thank you. My grandparents and my wife's grandparents, as well as many other family members, were murdered in the Holocaust. Yet, since 1980, I have bought Mercedes cars. And I think, if I recall at the time, my justification was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my justification was that Israel had mostly Mercedes taxis. And I figured, okay, I'll buy a Mercedes. But my question to you is that also true in Europe, where you have lived? Do the Jews think they shouldn't buy German items like cars and so on? Or do they not pay attention to that?
I would say, it's 50-50 on that question. I think, my personal opinion is that everybody should be free to choose whatever they want to buy. I think people should really make that own decision for themselves. But to your question, in Europe, or at least in the Netherlands, where I grew up, and in Germany, where I have lived for the past 4.5 years, before moving to Tel Aviv, there are Jewish families who refuse adamantly to buy any kinds of car manufacturing, any kinds of German cars, and there are those who do buy them. And yeah, I mean, that sentiment it's certainly, I know that sentiment is very is certainly in the circles of survivors in the United States. I know that it's always a very much a topic of discussion, and that is similar in Europe, I would say.
Thank you.
Again, I want to thank you also for being here. This is fascinating information, a little hard to digest, to say the least. One issue, one question I have regards the appropriation for those individuals who were penalized in some fashion. What happened to those appropriations? So who took them? Were they made as reparations? Were they just added to the GNP for a particular country? What happened with that?
Are you referring to the appropriations by German businessmen and the Nazi regime of Jewish-owned companies or assets?
No,
or
actually in their trial of those businessmen after the war.
They were put under trustee by they were called were called asset control, mainly by the United States government, or the Omgus, the military government of the United States in occupied Germany. And they were, for the most part, returned to their owners.
Thank you.
So I mean, there's very few. Sorry, I can't think of one example of a company owned by a German industrialist or a German business that was expropriated, or that was appropriated for part by the U.S. government, and that was kept, that was not returned to them. That was kept in any times of longevity by the United States. That no.
Gee, I had a question, and now I'm getting a senior moment. Oh, here, let's have some older seniors come in, and maybe I'll remember what I was going to say.
I would like to ask, of these 5 families today, do you have a sense of what their opinions are of Israel and Jews at this time?
I do not. I do not. I mean, the spokesperson for Porsche empathetically stated that, you know, I wanted them to take a stance or to provide their opinion on what they thought about Ferry Porsche's, their exalted founders, you know, anti-Semitic statements, his voluntary application to the SS and entry, and his association with high-ranking SS officers after the war. And, you know, they empathetically say that we as Porsche are not an anti-Semitic company. That is about as far as I came of any reference to that subject. I mean, they did not want any of the companies or the families I spoke to or their spokesman. I only had one heir comment, which was a grandson of Friedrich Flick for my book. Did not say nothing to that effect.
I want to thank you for your discussion. I would like to know from an Israel point of view with these companies, the Mossad and all these, you know, we heard about the Mossad going around the world, killing or abducting Germans. Was anything from the Israeli side done to these families that you know of, or did they ever try to do anything, or were they more afraid of the Russian? Was our world more afraid of the communists than they were of the post-World War II Germans?
Wow, that's a. Are you asking if Israel was more afraid of the?
Israel and the world and America itself was more worried about the communists in Russia than they were about the Germans post-World War II.
Yeah, I can empathetically state that confirm that for the United States, but for Israel, I don't have any. I have never come across anything that Israel tried to do anything, or the Mossad or anything tried to do something similar to the industrialists or any of the industrialists that got off scot-free as they did as they capturing, you know, Eichmann or you know, or allegedly Mengele or you know, anything of that nature. I mean, it was very much focused on the high-ranking SS men who made it out and were, of course, responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews under their own purview, like Eichmann.
In your advanced material, you mentioned there were Jewish industrialists or bankers that had large sums in Germany, and they got out with pennies on the dollar. One was
Right.
the Rothschild funds that were there. Rothschild, and there was another bank that I think you meant.
Dreyfus.
Dreyfus. I'm just
Yeah.
curious what ultimately happened with those
Yeah.
funds that were absconded with.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the Dreyfus, sorry, the Rothschild Bank, the Austrian branch of the Rothschilds, which is the largest bank in Austria at the time, ended up fleeing to the United States, and the Austrian Rothschild Bank and branch was never reconstituted. That was the end. The bank was liquidated after the war. Assets were returned to the rightful Rothschild heirs of the Austrian branch, and they stayed in the United States. As for Willy Dreyfus, he fled to Switzerland in 1938. He was the owner of his family bank, the Dreyfus Bank. After August von Fink expropriated his bank, or acquired his bank under coercion, and he fought for, he fought for restitution and compensation after the war. I describe it in my book, but they didn't come to an agreement, and Dreyfus ended up actually pursuing compensation and restitution in the United States courts, and ended up losing a year before his death at 91. His case ended up getting dismissed by the United States Supreme Court. And he died at 91 in 76. So he fought for 40 years for restitution and compensation.
I have an uncle who owned a tire factory in Germany after World War I, and they gave him $1 for his factory. I'm not sure if they got reparations, because eventually that particular family did move back to Austria and had a fur business and did very well. Did they get reparations? That would be number one. The second question was, I have another uncle who went to college in the United States, and there were 5 Jewish guys in 1929 that went to medical school in Berlin from 1929 to 1934. Were they exposed to all this anti-Semitism during those years?
So your first question was whether your uncle got compensated?
Reparations, number one. And then the second question was, were they exposed to anti-Semitism in medical school from 29 to 34?
I mean...
And they did finish in Berlin.
Okay. I mean, I don't know. I mean, every reparation and compensation case was different. Some people were ultimately successful in their endeavors. Many people were not, on legal grounds, on legal tactics, on grounds of jurisdiction. So, who knows? As to your second question, anti-Semitic legislation became codified in Nazi Germany within weeks of Hitler seizing power. So, luckily for your uncle's friends from college, they managed to graduate prior to the implementation of the Nuremberg race laws in September 1935. They graduated in 1934, where the disenfranchisement of Jewish citizens of Germany was increasingly being ramped up, but was not as severe as post September 1935. But I am certain that your uncle's friends from college were exposed to the, both personally and witnessed the anti-Semitic legislation that was being put in place by Hitler's regime in 1933, 1934, without a doubt.
Bruce, Steve and Rona have their hands up from Zoom.
Rona, did you want to go first, Rona? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. Mrs. Jong, a very interesting topic. I really wanted to hear about the Nazis and all the treasures. The 5 families that had these huge industrial complexes, what happened to the Jews that worked for them?
Well, that ranged. I mean, that depended on the company, but mostly they were fired in 1933, 1934. The main family I write about, the Quandts, Günther Quandt, the family patriarch, removed all his Jewish executives from his supervisory boards. And as I describe it in my book, lightheartedly, he did that swiftly and without, any remorse or any problem, without any kind of moral conundrum about that. There's also an example in my book where Günther Quandt saves, or at least pays, one of his executives so he can flee to the United States and settle in Ohio as a professor of metallurgy at Case Western in Pittsburgh, I believe. But that was only done because this man, George Sachs, was important to important to his business. I mean, it was done on purely opportunistic reasons. I mean, the vast majority of men I write about in my book were not convinced anti-Semites. I would say, many of their business associates, their executives, the bankers that they used, their executives on their board, there were many who were Jewish. They had zero problems firing them. And there are a few characters in the book who are convinced anti-Semites, but for the most part, the men I write about were ideologues. Were opportunists and not ideologues. They used the rule. They played along with the rules of the regime to expand their own fortunes and business empires.
Thank you.
Rona.
Yeah. Can you tell me what political parties do these companies support today, and what influence do they have on the government today?
Yeah,
and
that's a very good question. So the Quandt family, or at least the heirs, who Stefan Quandt and Susanne Klatte, these 2 siblings, were Germany's wealthiest family, actually one of the world's wealthiest family. They have 40 billion. They oversee a fortune estimated at 40 billion. Are the largest annual donors to the Christian Conservative Party, the CDU, which was Angela Merkel's party. Their previous spokesman, was the main spokesman of Helmut Kohl. His successor, their current spokesman, which I had for 20 years, was a spokesman for the CDU, for a CDU politician. The people on their board was the former, one of the people on their foundation board. It was the spokesperson for who tried to be Angela Merkel's successor, Armin Laschet. So it is very much a CDU clique, or the Christian Conservative clique, and to a lesser extent the free market liberal party, the FDP, which is currently in government, which they support. It is not the Social Democrats or the Green Party that these families tend to support. It is generally the CDU, which is, for post-war Germany's the party of money and of capital, of money and power, and the establishment party. So yeah, they the Quandts, or the BMW Quandts, are the largest annual donors to the CDU. And the Utgers, another family in my book, are big CDU donors and also active in the party. The Quandts also donate to the FDP. And as for the other three, and then there's the von Finks, which were allegedly the largest backers of the AfD, the far-right party. August von Finks Jr., which I describe in my book, this whole murky trail, kind of a dark money trail that came up in the more recent years between 2013 and 2016, of him allegedly financing the AfD, the far-right party, which came in as the largest opposition party in the German parliament in 2017, pardon.
Life insurance was very popular in Germany in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
I understood from readings that many insurance companies demanded a death certificate, and death certificates were not issued to people killed in the Holocaust. Whatever was the resolution of those matters?
Allianz has actually done, I always hold up Allianz as a company which has actually done a good job, a very good job today, about being extremely transparent about the atrocities that they were part of, not only demanding the death certificate of those murdered in the Holocaust, so of ensuring concentration camps, not paying out Jewish policy holders, or refusing to pay out Jewish policy holders. And for the most part, Allianz settled these claims in a class act settlement, and it's today extremely transparent if you go on the website of Allianz about how they took advantage or refused to pay out or insured concentration camps, and it's very cognizant and, again, historically transparent about that history in English, which makes it accessible to a global audience and makes the reckoning, for the most part at least, sincere.
Okay. Julie asks, what did Rosenberg do when he got to the US?
So Adolf Rosenberger settled under the name of Alan Arthur Robert in Los Angeles, and he became he did various odd jobs. He still designed cars. He designed cars for Hollywood movie sets. He died, unfortunately, relatively young at age 67 in 1967 of a heart attack. I mean, he was a broken man after not only being pushed out of the Porsche car company, but also being erased from Porsche history. But yeah, I mean, his main profession was still car design, but now it was as Hollywood props.
Did your research reveal any other justification for the allowance of these, let's call them so-called war criminals, to be allowed back into society? And the reason I say that is it's very easy to say we're trying to stop Russia, but the United States single-handedly rebuilt Japan. And the United States has a history of being, the State Department during World War II was terribly anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And so is it not really a strong possibility that the United States could have sent over executives to rebuild Germany, as in a year, we created a war machine that was building thousands of planes, tanks, ships.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, we might have needed the scientists because they had certain education and certain training. But when it comes to running companies, the United States had plenty of people that could do
Right.
that. And given the fact that if you look at history, the robber barons, the building of the railroads by the slaves who were Chinese,
Yeah.
the United States has an equal history, as does most of Europe and the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
So I really question what the real motivation might have been to let these people go back into their jobs without paying a price for what they did.
I mean, I'm loath to speculate on that, but you're absolutely right. I mean, there were deeply ingrained anti-Semitic sentiments in the State Department, in the War Department, in other executive levels of government during World War II. I mean, Roosevelt himself was, castigated for not doing anything, for not bombing the track trains to Auschwitz. I mean, I have not found anything in my research that indicates anything than a policy decision that was politically expedient, that was in the United States, in the best interest of the United States government. I did not come across any insidious interest that indicated it might have, that it was anything other than that.
Do you see any parallelisms between the Russian oligarchs and these major companies that we see in Germany?
I mean, there's a couple of differences. First of all, the Russian oligarchs own mainly commodity companies, right? They don't own companies that are for public consumption for the most part, except if you like Chelsea Soccer Club, but that is also an extension of soft power that Roman Abramovich allegedly, on the instructions of Vladimir Putin, acquired. It is different, I would say, in the sense, I mean, the similarity is, of course, these men, the Russian oligarchs, got in charge of these or became controlling or majority shareholders of these Russian commodity companies in the Wild West of Russia of the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, and made this devil's pact with Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s, where they consolidated their power and money in exchange for fealty to Vladimir Putin. But of course, I would say that's where the comparison ends.
But okay, these companies supported the Nazi regime during the war, didn't they? Or
yes, no. I mean, obviously, these oligarchs also support Putin today. No, make no mistake about that. So it is a continuation of it, but they're not. These oligarchs are not, to the extent of my knowledge, are mass producing for Russia's war machine. They're keeping it. They're keeping Russia's war machine, of course, through their energy sources, keeping it afloat. But the recent evidence has not yet borne out that that there are extermination camps. And mind you, I mean, this is also something, many of these Russian oligarchs are also, have a Jewish background and are Jewish as well. Many, not all, but, so you don't see, mass concentration camps or, them contributing to a consistent genocide. I mean, they're contributing fealty to they're giving fealty to a Russian dictator that is doing all these things, that is shipping off Ukrainian citizens in the Donbass and the Donetsk to Russia coercively. And they are giving fealty to it, but I haven't seen any proof yet that they are being used, that the Ukrainians are being used as forced and slave laborers in their companies. So there are parallels certainly, but it's not, it's not a play-on-play comparison that one can make. We have to be careful with these, there's nuances, we should be careful with those.
Unfortunately, many people are not.
No, exactly. Well, yes, indeed. No, I would agree with you on that, Bruce.
Let me, switch the topic a little bit. Has German reparations helped the Israeli economy and how it's growing now since you're covering Middle East business? And do you see any linkages there that might be going on?
I mean, to my extent, to the extent of my knowledge, there is the German reparations and the success of Israel, or the economy of Israel, that is not. It's a very interesting question, and somebody should look into. But as of yet, and I have not done any research into it, I am not aware to what extent reparations were paid between 1950 and the 1990s or the 2000s have had any major contribution to Israel, to the Israeli economy, which has been, to the extent of my knowledge, successful in raising capital itself, successful in building itself up. Whatever German reparations there were, I played a marginal role, if that, in any of that.
Thank you. Oh, Jack has a question.
I'm just curious. Do you have any knowledge of what happened in Japan after World War II? I assume that those industrialists that ran Mitsubishi and made all the fighters and whatever, they came out pretty much the same as probably the Germans did after the war. I would assume, but I don't know for sure.
I know nothing, unfortunately, about Japanese or Asian business. I have my handful with European, Middle East, and American business as it is over the past 10 years.
I can understand that. Does anybody else have any questions? I mean, David has been so open, and thank you, David. You've been so thorough in your presentation, and I really enjoy it. So you have a big kudos from everybody here.
Well,
I'm sure everybody wants.
Thank you,
to
Bruce.
say,
It's been a pleasure.
does anybody else have something to ask before we bid adieu? Oh, come on, guys. You normally are a lot more talkative than this. All right. What?
Any bad emails to you after writing this book, or anti-Semitism towards you after writing this book?
It's only been out a week, or not even a week. It's only been out 6 days. So far, actually, no, bar a few, sideways anti-Semitic comments on Twitter, or like some, kind of strange messages in my Twitter inbox. And Twitter itself is always quite a cesspool as it is. No, it has been, knock on wood, it's been, there has not been any. The German translation is going to come out. I'm going to go over to Germany for a book tour in mid-May. So I'm very curious how the reception is going to be over there, and what that will do in regards to comments and such. But we'll see. I'm happy to report back. Well,
very good. That raises a question I guess we all have. We see rising anti-Semitism here in the States.
Yeah.
How is it in Europe? We see now and then there's a march in Denmark, which they had totally anti-Semitic things going on. What's happening in Europe too? Is that increasing also?
You know, unfortunately, it is. You know, it is. I mean, you see, it mainly exerts itself in online comments, right? It's particularly in Germany, and in the Netherlands too. People are extremely vigilant, and the police is vigilant, extremely vigilant when it comes to any anti-Semitic comments, any sorts of show of anti-Semitism. But unfortunately, it has risen because of the vitriol that is spewed online, as opposed to in demonstrations and in kind of public denunciations by either, you know, politicians in the Netherlands or Germany, although you have those too. I mean, no, I mean, let's not make any mistake about it. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in Western Germany, in France. You know, you just saw it with Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, the right wingers battling it off in the French presidential election. Macron ended up winning yesterday, but you know, you see, especially in France, where you have both kind of the old Catholic far right, as well as the, you know, those from the French former colonies, you know, Jew, and my uncle lives in Paris. You know, my Jewish uncle lives in Paris, and my aunt and my cousin. But you see so many thousands of French Jews leaving France and moving to Israel. And France, of course, has the largest Jewish community in Europe today. Still, you know, in my native Netherlands, you know, the Netherlands was, after relative to population, had the most Jews deported to concentration extermination camps behind Poland and Hungary. So the Jewish community in the Netherlands is relatively small. You know, of course, the Jewish community in Germany is also relatively small. I believe it's 100,000 people on a population of 84 million. And the awareness, of course, in German collective, you know, collective memory and Dutch collective memory. I mean, there is a lot done to combat anti-Semitism. Let's not make a mistake about that. But you know, it's not enough. And unfortunately, with the rise of social media and the rise of the far right globally, you know, it's rearing its ugly head again.
In your conclusion in your book, do you feel the subsequent generations who were born after the war, should they feel guilt about what their forebears did? Or are they exonerated from that guilt and their achievements allowed to be enjoyed?
You know, I think they should not feel guilt. What I do think they have is, with great power comes great responsibility, given that they control some of the world, that they control swaths of the global economy and control some of the most well-known brands and control billion-dollar fortunes. They do have a larger responsibility to, at the very least, at the bare minimum, be transparent about the history of their patriarchs, the history of their companies that they control. Because, you know, at the end of the day, one only learns from history at the bare minimum by showing it. So I don't think they should feel guilty. What I do think is that they have a moral obligation to be transparent about their history at a bare minimum.
I agree with you. Rona, you have a question.
Yeah, I was in Germany maybe 15, 20 years ago, and it seemed to me that the anti-Semitism that we saw was predominantly in what was the East Zone.
Yes,
And I'm wondering if that's true today as well.
it is true. It is true. The eastern states, Sachsen, Brandenburg, and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and Thüringen and Saxon-Anhalt are the most, of course, after the reunification, were left to be, you know, the most economically and educationally backwards. This is also where the AfD, where the far right gets its most votes from. People are, it's not only where you see the most anti-Semitism, it's also where you see the most where you see the rise of the most anti-immigrant, anti-Islam, and I mean, it's all the antis you can think of. But of course, in case of anti-Semitism, you saw the attack on a synagogue in Halle 2 years ago was in East Germany, and it is, you know, it's where you see, yeah, it is where you see it the worst. That it has not changed in the past 20 years. It has stayed similar, or it has exacerbated.
So do you think it was the Russian control of that area that's responsible for that?
No, in an extent it is, because it's a frustration with their economic or their position in society, both economically and educationally, vis-a-vis the West German, who are thriving and who are extremely wealthy and who are receiving the best education. And they find that disgruntlement, they exert that disgruntlement in anti-Semitic comments, in finding no way out of their despair or despair, of their economic despair, of their frustration. I mean, it is a tale as old as the world, you know. I mean, it's yeah. So in extent, yeah, the Soviet control certainly had to do with it, but to the extent of my knowledge, yeah, it was mainly also the flawed reintegration of Germany after reunification that is also indebted to it to a large extent.
Thank you.
Martin, you have your hand up.
I do. A follow-up of a question you had a moment ago about guilt that the Jews might feel. My question is, what do you think about the guilt that the Polish people or the Ukrainian people might feel about the Holocaust and what they did, or what they?
Wow. If we take the latest legislation in Poland, where of course also a nationalistic right-wing government is currently in charge, if that is any indication of how things are in Poland, there is at least on the side of the government in Poland is now, you can get thrown in jail if you say the Polish activities in the Holocaust. It all has to be referred to Germany. You always have to refer to Poland as Nazi occupied or German occupied. If you say anything about the Polish activities or involvement within the Holocaust, you can get sued and get fined or thrown into jail. So if we take the recent legislation and the recent stance of the current Polish government as an indication, there is, you know, they don't feel guilt, or there is no, that sentiment, or at least a reflection on the activities of Polish citizens and their contribution to the Holocaust and their role in the Holocaust is being actively punished, you know, to acknowledge that is being actively legislated against. And I can't say anything about Ukraine. I don't know enough about Ukraine to judge that. You know, I mean,
But did you find any families that were different, that might have tried to support a moral platform, but were forced to work with the war machine, but were not as virulent in their support, that really tried to be outliers?
Yeah, I mean, I give the example of Robert Bosch, who was a very progressive German industrialist, who Bosch, of course, the company itself is world renowned still today. He died in 1942, and he had a very dual role, because at one hand, through his right hand man, he funneled money to the German resistance, and he was very much anti-Hitler and anti-Nazi. However, his industrial conglomerate also mass-produced weapons for the Nazi war machine, and also used to a lesser extent forced labor. So even those who ideologically really opposed the Nazi regime still played along with its industrial rules, or with its economic rules.
Bruce, you have a question from Yossi Hollander on Zoom.
Thank you for telling me. Yeah, yes, Yoshi.
Thank you for all you're doing. Couple of questions. One, the data today shows that the majority of anti-Semitism in Western Europe is Islamist, that including Germany and Holland. You didn't mention that. We kind of used to the right, but it is Islamist in its nature. Definitely the violent one. The second, but interesting, and I wanted to get your perspective, is I visited the Museum of Perpetrators in Berlin. And there's a whole section basically that shows that most of them got away, most of the SS murderers, etc.
Yes.
The judicial system were all populated basically by Nazis appointed during the Hitler, and they were never changed. So do you find that connected to the whatever happened to the industrialists?
As to your first question, yeah, that is correct. I mean, I would say that 50% or even 60% of anti-Semitic actions today are perpetrated. Part of it is still the kind of the old or like our neo-Nazis, or our just white Christian anti-Semites. But exactly, for the most part, it is people with a immigration background, from an Islamic background. Absolutely, it counts for the Netherlands, for Germany to a lesser extent, but certainly in France, where I alluded to earlier. Absolutely. As to your second question, I mean, the power structures that were in place in Nazi Germany on all levels of society, not only the legal levels, but on educational level, on business level, on political levels, went unbroken from Nazi Germany into West Germany and East Germany. I mean, the continuation of the power structures, even preceding Nazi Germany, it went along uninterrupted. There is nowhere where you can say that there was really a paradigm break in society at that time, where Nazism was, or where the remnants of Nazism were successfully rooted out, that you can say, well, no, there was a new structure put in place.